So good morning. This is Chair Rena Moran. Pursuit of House Rule 10.01. I call the remote meeting of the House Ways and Means Committee to order. The clerk would take the roll.
Chair Moran.
Present.
Moran, present. Vice Chair Olson.
Present.
Olson, present. Representative Garofalo.
Present.
Garofalo, present. Representative Albright. Representative Albright. Representative Becker-Finn.
Present.
Becker-Finn, present. Representative Bernardi.
Present.
Bernardi, present. Representative Eklund.
Present.
Eklund, present. Representative Hansen.
Hansen, present.
Hansen, present. Representative Hassan.
Hassan is present.
Hassan, present. Representative Hertas. Representative Hertas. Representative Hornstein.
Ornstein, present.
Hornstein, present. Representative Johnson.
Present.
Johnson, present. Representative Kresha, excused. Representative Liebling.
Present.
Liebling, present. Representative Lilly. Representative Lilly. Representative Mariani. Representative Mariani. Representative Marquardt.
Present.
Marquardt, present. Representative Miller.
Present.
Miller, present. Representative Nash.
Present.
Nash, present. Representative Nelson. Representative Nelson.
Nelson seems to be having trouble finding the Zoom. So can someone resend them the information?
I'll take care of that, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Representative Noor.
Noor, present.
Noor, present. Representative O'Neill.
Present.
O'Neill, present. Representative Pulowski.
Pulowski, present.
Pulowski, present. Representative Petersburg.
Present.
Petersburg, present. Representative Pinto.
Present.
Pinto, present. Representative Schumacher.
Schumacher, present.
Schumacher, present. Representative Schultz.
Present.
Schultz, present. Representative Scott.
Here.
Scott, present. Representative Sundin.
Present.
Sundin, present. Representative Albright.
Present.
Albright, present. Representative Hertas. Representative Lilly. Representative Mariani. Representative Nelson.
Present.
Nelson, present. And Representative Hertas. I believe he joined.
Present.
Hertas, present. That concludes the roll. There's a quorum present.
Great, there is a quorum present. And so our next agenda item is approval of the minutes from our hearing on Monday, January the 25th. The minutes were included in the hearing documents emailed to you by the committee staff. Are there any questions or corrections on the minutes? If not, the chair will entertain a motion to approve.
So moved, Chair.
Pardon me?
So moved, Madam Chair.
Representative Noor moves approval of the minutes for January the 25th, 2021. Please unmute briefly for a voice vote. All in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? The motion prevails and the minutes are approved. Thank you, members. So today we will have a presentation by the Minnesota Management and Budget of Governors, of the Governor's 22-23 budget recommendations. So we do have Commissioner Schowalter along with the Assistant Commissioner Reitan, who who will be presented today. Members, I have invited Commissioner Schowalter to join us today to provide us with a high-level presentation of the governor's budget recommendations for the fiscal year 2022 and 23. I know that there are several finance committees who have already begun receiving presentations for their respective agencies to examine the governor's proposal in greater detail. So the commissioner today will provide us with a more global look at how this budget is being balanced and the guiding strategy used to generate savings and to make new investments. I also wanted to come back with a great question that Representative Creshaw asked in committee last week about how we can measure the impact that budget proposals can have on equity. So if you look at the budget books prepared by the administration for each agency, you will see that any change items recommended by the governor includes an equity and inclusion analysis. So as part of this presentation, I have asked Commissioner Schowalter to help us understand how state agencies prepare their notes and how the legislature can tap into that process as we assemble our own budget. So with that, I would like to welcome the commissioner to the committee and will ask him to begin his presentation. And my hope is that we can allow the commissioner to complete his presentation and then we can ask questions. Thank you, members. To Commissioner Schowalter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone. For the record, my name is Jim Schowalter, Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget, and I just appreciate the chance to present before you today. With me is State Budget Director Britta Reitan and others from MMB, and we will try to give you an overview, some of the materials that we presented this last week with the governor regarding his budget recommendations, and give you hopefully an overview of the key issues, key themes in the budget, and stand for questions as the committee pleases. So I started as commissioner about, it seems like a long time ago, but it was about 4 months ago. And at the time, releasing this budget seemed a long time away. It seemed like there's so much time to get this done. Maybe focused on COVID over the summer and relief, but bottom line, there was plenty of time. Challenge was actually COVID just kept on coming, and more things kept on coming. So that this budget is a really unique document in that, the budget staff was at the same time working on federal funds and understanding what the challenges were for financing COVID relief, even when the specter of expiring state and federal funds was coming on December 31st. It happened even as we were working through how to keep long-term care facilities and hospitals afloat when there was a surge in the pandemic in November and December. And it happened even as there was unrest and civil disturbances in January and concerns about what was going to happen. And then finally, it still happened even as we are getting new federal direction going forward. So there's been a lot of changes, a lot of things that have been managing, and I just want to thank the team at MMB. It's spectacular work in getting us to this place. Madam Chair, members, one of the things, and I'll go to the first slide, one of the key things about a budget is that it's just not a math exercise. It will add up, it will go through that, but it is also a statement of vision and priorities for the governor and lieutenant governor. And that was one of the things that they said very, very much at the beginning of this process. We want to make sure it represents where we want to go and what are some of the things that we want to make sure Minnesotans know and look forward to in the future. And with that starting point, there's really three themes that you're going to see throughout the budget. One is that we will be working to support small businesses and drive towards economic recovery. In fact, the governor called the entire package a recovery budget. Two, it's ensuring education and helping students catch up on learning. Again, a key challenge and a key impact of the pandemic is how does this affect our schools and kids' learning? And more than half of the new investments in this budget are in this particular area. And finally, supporting working families. A lot of families have had jobs, have lost their jobs, are trying to figure out how to keep things going. And how do we help families through all of the disruption that's going on right now? Make sure that their kids, their loved ones, their communities remain strong and vibrant. These are the core principles and core themes that we looked at in building this budget. The reason is pretty simple. The COVID-19 pandemic has really disrupted, has really hit public health, and continues to be the key to what we're trying to work through and get past and build towards recovery. In that recovery, about $885 million is dedicated towards education for our kids in schools to help expand extensive summer learning programs inside and outside of classrooms to help kids catch up on learning, to fund mental health and school support personnel, and then also in the nuts and bolts of the education system throughout the state, providing targeted supports to students in need, increase the basic education formula by 1% and 2.5%, and other things that ultimately keep our schools going through this time of change. And finally, to continue supporting our institutions of higher education, those drivers of education, job readiness, and opportunity. And we have a number of different ideas there. Supporting working families, you're going to see in the materials that the budget director will walk through, we have about $235 million in different ideas. And that includes things like the paid family medical leave program, the working family credit, expansion of childcare. And finally, in supporting businesses, there's $157 million. Some of the ideas there you're going to see is supporting small businesses through emergency loans, ideas about reskilling and supporting adult learners to stabilize the workforce and help people get new activities and opportunities when so many of the businesses that we've been accustomed to are struggling to either survive or find a new niche. Supporting broadband infrastructure. There's a lot of different themes here, but the bottom line here is how do we recover from the pandemic and move forward? On slide 2, we'll take a quick look at the numbers. What you see here is a traditional MMB kind of table showing you the beginning balance, where we started with November forecast, and how the governor intends to change where we're at now to his recommendation. Intervening on, ironically, we've already had one special session. It's adjusted the numbers a little bit, but I'm taking a look from the forecast to the governor's rec. At the end of the November forecast, we had a budgetary balance of negative 883 by the 22-23 biennium. But of that, $1.3 billion was generated in the biennium. So the revenues and spending in the biennium didn't match by $1.3 billion. We still had healthy budget reserve though, and I think there's a really key factor. Unlike when we were going through the Great Recession, we still have budget reserves intact, and we still had an opportunity to use those to blunt some of the impact of the pandemic. In our recommendations, what you see here is a change of 1.6 million, almost $1.7 billion in new revenues on a net basis, and spending increases on a net basis of $1.3 billion. That includes about $150 million in budget reductions. Together, they handle the math challenge of that $1.3 billion deficit, making sure that we also address the vision challenge, the priorities that the governor and lieutenant governor have laid out, while still yielding a positive bottom line by the end of the 22-23 biennium. One key item in this is obviously the budget reserve. We're also recommending a decrease in the budget reserve of a little over $1 billion, $1 billion straightforward for helping balance the budget, an additional $38 million related to the Blue Ribbon Commission on Healthcare, and some of the recommendations we're not putting forward. But the $1 billion is kind of the key element. The reserve is there to help stabilize the budget, help give us time to adjust through tough times, and at the same time, not to buy our way past difficult decisions, difficult discussions that we're going to have this session. even with this $1 billion reduction, we still have $847 million left in the reserve. That is a significant cushion, and it gives us some confidence knowing full well that with the variant out there, with uncertain economic reactions in the national and world economy, we've still got a measure of options as we figure out what's going to happen in the February forecast and beyond. That, Madam Chair, is the overarching picture of the governor's budget recommendations, about $1.7 billion in revenue increases, $1.7 billion, about $1.3 billion in spending increases, including $1 billion in reserves. That net gets us to some of the changes that we're going to walk through, and I'm going to turn it over to the state budget director here. But it's I think, a key budget document to put into context that we're responding to the pandemic, continuing to go full out in a lot of non-traditional ways in trying to make sure that the public health is protected, that the economy is stabilized, that families are protected and have some certainty, and then ultimately put together proposals that help lead us out of that, knowing still that there's other information to be learned about the path of the pandemic, the path of federal response and opportunities, but we'll learn those. For now, this is, I think, a path that we want to go forward with. And if it's all right, Madam Chair, I'm going to turn it over to Budget Director Reitan for additional slides in detail about the budget.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Schowalter. To Assistant Commissioner.
Good morning. Thank you. Again, my name is Britta Reitan. I am the State Budget Director and an Assistant Commissioner at MMB. As I get started, I'm going to beg your forgiveness as I am experiencing some online learners at home today that don't actually have online learning happening today. So they are a little squirrely and running amok. So if a child shows up or if it gets a little loud, I apologize. So as I mentioned, my name is Britta Reitan. I'm Assistant Commissioner Budget Director at MMB. I'm going to turn to a little bit more detail on some of the themes that Commissioner Schowalter walked through before. So this first slide I'm going to walk through, give some detail on the investments in the area of education and ensuring students catch up on learning. One focus in this budget is for this upcoming summer to make sure there is more robust summer programming for students as we go into the summer of 2021. So the first item mentioned on this list is an expansion of summer programming for 2021. The governor's recommendation includes $57.5 million in federal dollars. So this is funding that we received in the December federal bill, and the governor's recommendation is to use $57.5 million of that funding to support summer programming for this upcoming summer. This would be voluntary full-day programming for this summer. In addition, the governor's budget recommendation includes summer 2021 preschool for 4 and 5-year-olds. There is $20 million in the governor's recommendation for that purpose. And this is for up to 12 weeks of programming that would be available for over 4,000 4 and 5-year-olds this summer. In addition, as the commissioner mentioned, there's also an increase on the basic funding formula in the governor's recommendation of 1% in 2022 and 2.5% in 2023. The total impact of that increase is $301 million in the 22-23 biennia. The logic behind the smaller percentage increase in the first year, the larger percentage in the second year, is because school districts will be receiving additional federal support from the December bill in this upcoming year. An additional area of focus in the governor's budget is holding the special education cross-subsidy constant. So the special education cross-subsidy is that unfunded portion of the cost of special education which districts would then need to cover with their general resources or what comes from their general education revenue. And what this $73 million in 22-23 is doing is holding that cross-subsidy constant. So essentially ensuring that the cross-subsidy does not grow in 22 and 23. And this is something we have been focused on for a number of years now. Commissioner Schowalter mentioned an investment in student support personnel. There's $47 million in 22-23 in order to provide a new aid to fund student support personnel at school districts and charter schools. This would be for counselors, nurses, social workers, psychologists, and would provide for funds for an estimated 325 professionals statewide. The governor's budget also includes additional funding for equalization and simplification of levies for school districts. This is really targeted at local optional revenue, operating revenue, and debt service equalization. These are all levies that are levied at the local level. And what this funding would provide for is an increased state share on those formulas. So essentially reducing the levy impact and increasing the state share, and it would really help low property wealth districts. And there's $95 million in the governor's budget for that purpose. As Commissioner Schowalter mentioned, there's various investments in the governor's recommendation that are really targeted at the opportunity gap in Minnesota. One of those is the expansion of rigorous coursework for BIPOC students. There's $10 million in the governor's budget for this purpose. This would provide grants to districts to add advanced placement, international baccalaureate, career and technical education, and concurrent enrollment offerings for students. Turning to the higher education space, Commissioner Schowalter will mention this as well. There is funding recommended that would flow through the Office of Higher Education, or OHE, for $35 million for a workforce stabilization grant program. This would provide grants for tuition and fees to be used at public institutions by individuals that have been impacted by COVID. So this is really, it's part of the ensuring students catch up on learning, but also part of that economic recovery and jobs piece of the governor's budget, because it's really focused on reskilling workers and preparing them for new job opportunities following the pandemic. And then we also have funding in the governor's budget to support our institutions of higher education, both the U of M and Min State. There is funding for the U of M of $46 million and about $65 million for Minnesota State, for a total of $110 million for the institutions of higher education. And with that, Laura, if you could turn to the next slide. So as the commissioner mentioned, another focus of the governor's budget is supporting small businesses and driving towards economic recovery. The governor's budget includes $50 million in the current year, so fiscal year 21, for a small business support loan program to assist the hardest hit industries. This would provide for partially forgivable loans to consumer-facing businesses and nonprofits that are really focused in the entertainment and cultural sectors. This is a sector that has been particularly hard hit as a result of the pandemic. The governor's budget also includes additional small business assistance, and the slide says $3 million. It's actually $3 million per year, so $6 million overall for the biennium. This would provide additional technical assistance, capital support, and incubator spaces for small businesses. This would be funds that flow through DEED. There's also $50 million for the expansion of broadband statewide. There's an additional $5 million for the program that's referred to as Launch Minnesota. This is really focused on growing Minnesota's innovation economy by accelerating startups and attracting talent to the state. And then there's also $7 million in 22 for the Angel Tax Credit. And this is a tax credit for investors that make equity investments in early stage companies, so to encourage growth in Minnesota. And then Laura, if you could turn to the next slide, please. As the commissioner mentioned, another focus of this budget is to support working families, or families in many cases that have been out of work this current year. So the governor's budget does include a one-time payment of up to $750 for families on the MFIP program. This is paid for with $24 million in federal TANF dollars. The governor's budget also includes a new paid family medical leave insurance program. This would provide wage replacement for family and medical leaves, and the premiums would be collected to fund this initiative. The governor's budget also includes an update to the maximum rate paid to providers through the Child Care Assistance Program, or CCAP. This would bring the payment to the 30th percentile of the most recent market survey. And this would be paid with federal dollars through the Child Care Development Fund. Additionally, there are some investments in here that are really on the revenue side and reflect a reduction in revenues. Those include the working family tax credit. So the working family credit would expand the size of the credit or the amount of the credit for those currently eligible, and would impact about 313,000 households, with the credit increasing by an average of $160. The governor's proposal also includes an expansion of the first tier of the income tax. So essentially, more income would be subject to the first tier instead of the second tier. So it really targets those individuals and families whose last dollar of income falls in the second tier, because more of that income would then be subject to the first tier. And the loss of revenue there is $95 million in 22-23 for that proposal. If you'll turn to the next slide. This slide provides kind of our normal breakdown in terms of how we show spending by bill area. So you can see how the overall investment breaks down by bill area. And as you can see from this slide, there is some spending in the current year, FY21, in this governor's budget. Largely in the area of public safety, jobs and economic development, and in education. Then you can see how the investments break down in 22 and 23. And again, as the commissioner mentioned, E12 education really sees the bulk of that investment in 22 and 23. And if you would, Laura, turn to the next slide. So this slide takes a look at the revenue side of the governor's budget. I will just walk through relatively quickly the changes on the revenue side of the budget. As I mentioned on the previous slide, the governor's budget includes an increase in the amount of the working family tax credit, as well as an expansion of the first tier of the individual income tax. Also, as part of the working family tax credit, the governor's budget also includes the ability for individuals and families to use an ITIN, or an individual taxpayer identification number, to qualify for the working family credit. I mentioned on a previous slide the fact that the governor's budget includes the Angel tax credit in FY22 and 23. And then moving to the tax increases that are included in the governor's budget. The governor's budget does add a fifth tier to the income tax. For married filers, this would be for income over $1 million. And for $750,000 for those filing as head of household, and $500,000 for single filers. And the rate on this fifth tier would be 10.85%. Just beneath that, you can see the capital gains tax increase that generates $486 million in the current, or excuse me, in the upcoming biennium. This is a surcharge added to capital gains income and dividend income over $500,000. There's also an increase to the corporate tax rate. The governor's proposal increases the corporate franchise tax rate to 11.25%. Additionally, there is a change for previously taxed foreign income. This creates an addition for foreign income that has been repatriated to the United States, and it is retroactive, effective back to 2016 for 965 income, into 2018 for income that is part of the GILTI provisions, and that is generating $336 million in 22 and 23. The governor's budget also includes some increases for cigarette and vapor tax. The cigarette tax in the governor's proposal would be increased by $1 per pack. The last major increase on the cigarette tax was in 2013. In 2017, the annual inflationary adjustment was repealed from law. And so this adds $1 per pack to the current rate. Additionally, for vapor products, both the solution and the devices for vapor products, this would add a gross receipts tax of 35%. The governor's budget also includes some modifications to the qualified data center tax exemption. This essentially modifies the sales tax exemption and limits the time period for which the exemption is available and the amount of the purchases that are available for the refund. And then the governor's budget also includes reinstating the estate tax inclusion back to 2.7 million. It was at 3 million. And so that it brings it back to the previous level of 2.7 million. It's important to note here that the proposal also adjusts the small business and farm property tax exclusion to maintain the current level of 5 million for those estates. But overall, the tax changes bring 1.636 billion on net into the general fund in 22 and 23. Then Laura, if you'll turn to the next slide. This slide takes a look at the changes in the reserves and the use of balances in the governor's current recommendation. And as you can see, and as the commissioner highlighted, after the governor has a use of reserves in 22 and 23, we still, by the end of 23, are projecting 847 million in the reserves. We highlighted a use of $1 billion in the reserve for 22 and 23 as part of the governor's budget solution. I want to also note that as part of the forecast and as part of the budget solution from the end of 2019, we're also using 491 million from the reserve. That was already assumed in current law. So that's why you see the level of the dark blue bar dropping by more than $1 billion. It's because it's the $1 billion that is recommended in the governor's budget in 22, as well as the 491 that was already assumed in current law. You'll notice that the reserve level drops again into 23. This is actually related to the Blue Ribbon Commission recommendations. As part of the 2019 budget solution, we were holding $100 million in savings related to the Blue Ribbon Commission, and the language in law said, if we don't fully adopt the Blue Ribbon Commission recommendations up to the $100 million, the remainder comes from the reserve. And so the governor's budget does adopt a little over 61 million of those recommendations, but as part of the governor's recommendation, he's also using 38 million from the reserve to get to that full $100 million for the Blue Ribbon Commission. And the last thing I want to highlight on this slide is the capping of the stadium reserve. You can see that the stadium reserve level is that little gray bar at the top. In the governor's budget, the stadium reserve is capped at 100 million, meaning any projected growth over and above 100 million that was part of the forecast would then fall to the bottom line of the general fund. And if you could, Laura, turn to the next slide. So with this last slide, I just want to highlight the long-term budget outlook with the governor's budget. The use of the reserves and other one-time resources like that do affect the structural balance in 22, 23, and 24, and 25. So you can see in 22 and 23, the actual, as we look at our revenues in that year compared to our spending in that year, we do have a structural imbalance in 22 and 23 of about 1.25 billion. We are essentially filling that gap with the use of the reserves, as I mentioned. So on a budgetary basis, we're actually carrying forward out of 22-23 with this budget 470 million. So we more than make up for that structural gap and carry forward 470 million from 22-23 into 24 and 25. Looking out into 24-25, you can again see we do have a structural gap between our forecast revenues and projected spending in 24-25, but we're essentially using that carry forward from 22-23 to narrow the gap on a budgetary basis. But we do still have a gap on a budgetary basis in 24-25 of 243 million. And with that, Commissioner Schowalter, I can pass it back to you if you'd like to wrap it up.
For sure. Thank you. Madam Chair, members, I appreciate the chance to walk through the governor's budget recommendations. And I want to start the Q&A part by just addressing the chair's question about how equity and inclusion shows up in this budget. Obviously, this has been a theme and a point of analysis throughout all of the budget discussions about making sure that revenues are progressive and looking at how those revenues are spent in order to stabilize and help people who have been most affected by the pandemic. But in particular, the budget documents themselves have a format in them that starts to address equity and inclusion questions in new initiatives. And so I just want to draw attention to the budget format. It was there 2 years ago. It's there again today. And as you go into your finance divisions, you'll see on a regular basis discussion from each agency about equity and inclusion and how new budget initiatives affect, improve, change, worsen equity and inclusion considerations, and try to get some direct attention to that. It's a piece of analysis and work that we're still working on. But I think it's an important thing to recognize that all of our initiatives don't affect everyone the same way, and that the budget documents need to continue to make sure that we see all people and all Minnesotans in them and understand that that information is before the legislature as you ultimately put together bills to adopt revenue changes, spending changes, and the balance that we have to put together this biennium and adopt this May. So with that, Madam Chair, I really appreciate the chance to present to you and the members and stand before you for any questions.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Schowalter and Assistant Commissioner Reitan. I really appreciate your presentation, and I would like to open it up for members' questions. Do anyone have any questions?
Madam Chair, I think Representative Garofalo had his hand up first.
Okay, let's start with Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner, as always, thanks for your presentation. In light of the struggling that we're seeing for working families, why are there so many regressive tax increases in the budget's proposal, taxes that raise taxes on lower and working class folks?
Commissioner Schowalter.
Madam Chair, Representative, I assume you're using regressive from the tax incidence study because very few struggling families make $20,000 a week, which would be what would be necessary to be impacted by the fifth tier proposal on income taxes. In fact, I don't think there's a single Minnesotan who's making $20,000 a week and is probably working at a restaurant right now. So the challenge here is to make sure that the impacts of the pandemic, which have largely hit families who are in the lower 40% of household income, how do we help them? And that's addressed through a couple of different ways: the working family credit, the expansion of the first tier, and ultimately the tax increases are really targeted towards those parts of the income spectrum that have been benefiting from the economy over the last few years.
Madam Chair and Commissioner, yes, I am using the tax incident study. That we don't care who collects the taxes, we care who pays them. And so the Minnesota tax incident study, which we've had for decades, shows that many of the tax increases that are being proposed are hurting lower and working class folks. So I will concede to you that the fifth tier and the capital gains tax, those are certainly those individuals you highlight. But I understand we have a philosophical difference on the size and scope of government, but why would there be so many tax increases that our own tax incident study shows hit the lower and working classes? How does that help them?
Yeah, Commissioner Schowalter.
Madam Chair, Representative, great questions. So there's a couple of taxes you're probably really focusing on, the cigarette and vapor tax. Absolutely. As discussion in previous years have suggested, a lot of that tax is paid across the spectrum and is regressive in nature. It is also true that the public health problems that are created by cigarettes and vapor also go along with consumption of those goods. And so there is an issue there, but that is hardly a cornerstone for the revenue proposals. It is an important one from a public health perspective, as well as from a revenue perspective. On the corporate taxes, which is the one that probably on the incident study is most notable. Now, just note that the corporate franchise tax actually affects not only Minnesota businesses, it affects any business that's doing work in Minnesota. So ultimately, the spending and how we're using those revenues also has to be taken into account. And that's definitely geared towards helping Minnesotans, particularly Minnesotans who have been hard hit by the pandemic, and helping develop a recovery here in Minnesota, regardless of where the corporation is based. So, you're right on the corporate taxes. And at the same time, note that how's that money also being spent? And how's that being spent to benefit Minnesotans, and which Minnesotans? That also has to be taken into consideration as you as a lawmaker have to assess, how to have the best benefit for Minnesota.
Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioner Schowalter. I have several questions and tremendous concern, as my previous colleague just mentioned, about how this is really hurting the working class. And really, this is raising revenue on the backs of really hardworking, really struggling people already. And let me give you just 3 examples. He gave you one pretty big one with corporate tax and the cigarette and vaping tax being one of the most regressive, hurting poor and working people. Let me give you 2 other examples that are actually really hurting really hardworking people that have really been impacted. And it's what's not in this particular proposal. And if I'm wrong, please correct me, but I listened very carefully. I read through the documents. But what I don't see, in fact, I had a tax professional get a hold of me just this morning, and he was so concerned that the PPP federal loan forgiveness there's no state conformity. There's no federal conformity to the state, to this particular provision. I didn't see that there. And what that does is it again raises taxes on these small businesses that are barely hanging on. They're hanging on with their fingernails. They have endured unimaginable struggles through this whole thing with COVID and the shutdowns, the government imposed shutdowns. So unless I'm missing it, I don't see a federal conformity to the PPP federal loan forgiveness program, which would directly increase taxes on these poor businesses that are already struggling. So please, just unless I'm missing it in your presentation, I didn't see that under small businesses. Another thing that I just realized as I'm going through the presentation that will really hurt those that are just on the margins is your higher ed proposal. Just confounds me. You're giving, so I'm on the higher ed committee, I'm the lead on the higher ed committee. And I happen to know that the University of Minnesota's full ask of $46.5 million, you have that in there. But for Min State, so Minnesota State University and College System has campuses all over Minnesota, and they're strategically located so that everyone in their community can go to either a community college, a state college. They have something within driving distance of where they live. That was a strategic plan that Minnesota has. And instead of the governor putting in the full ask of $130 million to take care, and the other side of Min State is that they don't have any options. Either Minnesota taxpayers help pay it, or they increase taxes, or excuse me, they increased the fees and the tuition on these students, but he only provided half of the ask. So the full ask for the University of Minnesota system, but the Min State system, he only put in half of their ask. So only 65 million of their 130 million that they need to keep their doors open, to keep tuition low. And that just confounds me. Again, that's people that are just on the margins trying to get by, and they're, maybe they have to get retrained. That's what the Min State system is there for. So please help me understand, why is that a part of this budget?
Commissioner Schowalter.
Madam Chair, Representative, thank you for that question. Those are a couple of very good questions. The first one, I'm going to need to defer to my colleagues at the Department of Revenue. In terms of federal conformity and the PPP loans, I am not conversant, and I'm not sure if anybody else on this call can address that question directly, but I'm going to need to defer that one because it's a good question. I know there's a lot of question out there about how the PPP loans will be handled. I think the core issue for everyone, again, is trying to have effective support for these struggling businesses, and what are the right tax treatments at a federal level, at a state level. I need to get some help from our colleagues at the Department of Revenue on that one.
We also have Melissa Lamb Young and Elizabeth Connor on the line. Can either of you, or should I put that over to the Assistant Commissioner?
I am thinking that we may have to get literally somebody from the Department of Revenue on that one. I'm not sure that our budget lead would be able to manage that tax question.
Okay. Do we have anyone who can respond to the question?
Madam, if not, Madam Chair, okay, is there? Because Madam Chair, if not, I would be happy to contact them and get back to you in the committee ASAP.
Yeah, Representative Neal raised a really good question, I think. So please have him to respond to that question. Representative Neal, any other questions?
No,
Oh, so I was just going to say then the question about why only half the ask to the Min State system, right, who literally are in every community around the state. Why is that?
Okay.
Absolutely.
Schowalter.
Madam Chair, Representative, a great question. And that one is definitely something we can handle. So the question on higher education funding, you're absolutely right. Each year, each budget, each of the two major systems come in with budget recommendations. And it is customary and expected that the governor and OHE, Office of Higher Education, will be looking at those and try to make adjustments and assessments, because the bottom line is, you don't want to set up a process where, the more you ask for, the more you get. So there's always that review process from the executive branch. I think the two requests from both systems were really prudent and really set in the context of the budget challenges that were coming forward at the time. I think if you look at the University of Minnesota's budget request, I would expect that it lines up low or lower than any of the budget asks that you've seen come forward to the state in many, many years, out of, I think, respect and understanding of the challenges that we have. I think the same is true for Minnesota State. What you have to look at is in the governor's recommendations, there were two key asks from Minnesota State. One was for an operational support for those campuses that you talked about statewide, the operational impacts of changed enrollment, distance learning, sustaining that network across the state. That is in the governor's recommendation. The second one was about students who need assistance, that basically in this time, a lot of students are either decreasing their credit load or stopping altogether because their part-time job is falling through. Their nighttime gig is not happening. And as a result, they're not able to continue going to school. That is in the governor's recommendation. It's just not housed in Minnesota State. It's housed within the Office of Higher Education to support the very purposes that Minnesota State was trying to accomplish. By putting it into Office of Higher Education, we're able to reach all the students. And I would expect a substantial part of those students will be going to Minnesota State colleges and universities, simply because that is where most of our students are going. So appreciate the question. You're absolutely right. It is one of those governance things of trying to look at those requests, see where they're trying to go, appreciate the work with both of those systems. And I think the governor's recommendations actually accomplish what both systems were trying to accomplish in this budget.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just say that, you know, as you have said, this is a moral document, and I think that very regressive taxes that are in this particular proposal and only funding half of them in state system of what they need to survive and keep their doors open. And then also, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure I didn't see this in the document about the federal conformity for the PPP loans and other SBA loans as well, that we don't want to further burden and do all these tax increases on the backs of the people that are barely surviving. You know, I have a place up and down 7th here in St. Paul, and it is dark. There are so many restaurants that have gone under and probably will not be coming back. There are businesses that are closed all over this state and probably won't be coming back. So those that are still around and still hanging on, I don't think that we need to heavily burden them. So I really would encourage you to take a better look, a closer look at this moral document and make sure that it is, in fact, what you say, that it is, and in fact, it is regressive. It is not a progressive budget. And so I would just encourage you to relook at what you've just presented because your words and your numbers don't match, unfortunately.
Representative Lilly.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioner. Thank you for coming back to the state and helping us out. Did a great job on your last run, and I'm glad you're back to help us, and thank you for that. Commissioner, I just kind of want to go back and the federal money. How does that show up exactly? And is there documentation to show kind of where that's kind of plugged in? I'd be curious to see that. You could just send me something or tell us kind of a brief narrative of how that shows. And then, you know, as the federal government's talking again about this new bill, you know, how is that going to impact us? And where would we possibly see that in our budget? Or, you know, I know that's, you know, it's not law, but I'm sure you're paying attention to the discussion and that sort of thing. And then with this, so if you could help me there. And then I have a question on, I don't see anything for soil and water conservation districts, and there's about a $20 million problem there. And I don't see an environment budget, so I don't know if you're thinking legacy or if you're thinking, so anyways, that's there. You might not even be aware of it. It's a little wonkish, but it's a big number, so we got to kind of figure it out. But if you could help me, Commissioner, and again, welcome back. Thank you.
Commissioner Schowalter, do you have any response or you just want to?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair, Representative. There's a couple of pieces that I can address. I'm not sure if the State Budget Director knows about the water and soil question, which we can wrap up with. On the federal funds, you're absolutely right. It's a big consideration and a big concern in trying to put together this budget because, as you know, the second stimulus bill happened right around the end of December. And even as we were putting together the budget recommendations, we were learning about the specifics about what was going to be available for Minnesota. Because it's not just a matter of Congress acting and you get a check. You know, obviously it goes to the federal agencies, there's state allocations, they go through formulas, they have funding, grant requests. And the bottom line is we're, I think, at this point now starting to understand those things. As the Ways and Means Committee, as well as in individual committees, you can find out about that information in a couple of different ways. One is federal funds form. In the budget document, we have a consistent federal funds list, itemizing all of the federal funds that are out there and basically anticipated to be included in this budget. So that is one place that you can see all of the different grants and the information that goes with them. I would say that for some of the parts of the governor's budget, you know, there are large numbers that we don't highlight as much, but I'll try to sort of walk through them because they're really important in the construction of the budget. They include in education, the ESSER funding of about $500 million that's going directly to school districts. That money was part of the thinking behind the governor's approach towards school funding for this biennium, with a smaller amount in the first year and a larger amount in the second year, knowing full well that many school districts are getting a large one-time resource from the federal government, but not having ongoing resources. And there's always that danger of creating expectations and ongoing obligations with one-time money. For transit, mass transit, we were looking and talking about the difficulties for the Met Council, for all transit providers. And the bottom line there was that current revenues and current operating revenues weren't covering their bills. Again, one of the pieces of that December federal assistance was additional funding for all of those transit providers. And so as a result, Met Council is getting significant help directly from the federal government. And as a result, you're not seeing a new initiative in the governor's recommendation at this point in time, because at least for the time being, they can work with those federal funds. There's similar money for rental housing. Minnesota Housing is getting substantial help from the federal government so it can help people throughout the state get rental assistance or get help paying their mortgage because they've been impacted and hurt by COVID-19. So those are a couple of the really large dollar amounts. What you're not seeing in that bill was like a flexible state assistance, with the exception of the Medicaid funding, where we counted it in the forecast because we knew it was coming. And that helped us decrease our state spending, and that made our state numbers look better. So those are kind of the push and pull, the things that are going on where you see large amounts of money. You'll see those in the budget documents. You'll see them in the federal funds report. They impacted what we were asking for in state resources. We asked for less simply because those federal help dollars were available. And that gets us to like this next wave. I don't know what's going to happen with the next, with the congressional discussions with the Biden administration, where they're going to end up. Obviously, that's going to have a big impact again on state budgets across the board. I can say that Minnesota is relatively well positioned compared to other states. We've already taken a look at our revenues. I think we've already adjusted and understood where we're at. We have a better reserve situation than many other states. That said, testing, vaccination, going to be big costs. I would expect it's probably going to be a likelihood of more help down the way in trying to respond to COVID-19. I would expect and hope that there's other programs. We're going to find out. But at this point, it's really premature to put a number out there. Ideally, we would know before the February forecast.
Right.
But I think that's more ideally. We will see in the next few weeks whether that information is known and well enough known and understood and enacted so that we could put it into the update in the budget. So, Madam Chair, those are the questions. Water and soil, I'm less clear about. And if Britta doesn't know, we'll have to follow up.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I can jump in.
Assistant Commissioner Reitan, please go ahead.
Yes, Representative Lilly, you are correct. There isn't a funding source identified at this time for the Soil and Water Conservation District funding. I know this is something that's on the governor's office radar, and we will continue those conversations.
Representative Lilly.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the input on both these issues. Thank you, and great work. Thank you.
Representative Hertas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to just bring up a couple of subjects. One is about the budget reserve. And secondly, some concerns about the capital gains tax proposal. First of all, on the budget reserve, I've been around here long enough to remember when there was no budget reserve. And actually, because of legislation that was passed back in 13-14 biennium, our November forecasts were transferring any amount, or 1/3, I should say, of any excess projected surplus goes to the budget reserve. So it's taken a whole 10 years to build a budget reserve up to where we currently are. Now, taking that money, and we certainly have a budget reserve for a purpose, but even going back to the May updated revenue forecast, we had no idea of the federal stimulus and the support at the local level or state level that would be added on to unemployment benefits, as well as monies directly to the states for spending. And so, you know, the necessity to tap that budget reserve, you know, I just don't see it as warranted to be taking $1 billion and increasing our base spending in a time when our economy has really been hammered pretty hard by our responses to COVID, and particularly executive orders in response to COVID. So, you know, what we've experienced over the last many biennia is, as we approached getting a full budget reserve and with a very robust economy pre-COVID, it was creating opportunities for either additional spending, or it was creating opportunities to further expand and grow our economy by lowering the burdensome tax rates that Minnesota ranks in the nation. So I don't think depleting the budget reserve at this time is a good idea, because what that's going to mean is any future projected surpluses will circumvent spending and or tax rollbacks in terms of growing and expanding our economy. Now, over the weekend, I saw that according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, Minnesota ranks 8th in the nation for the number of job losses at 8.3%, December to December. So I'm again presuming that that has to do with the response to COVID and the shutting down of a lot of businesses. And it's very clear that Minnesota, with regard to those executive actions, has been a little more harsh than a lot of the states. That said, I've had a number of emails from people who are just hanging on, many who have failed, but the ones that are hanging on have had to dispose of assets to maintain liquidity during this difficult time. They're doing that and disposing of assets and creating liquidity for the benefit of not only themselves and their business, but for their employees. And so now what we're proposing to do is to go back and retroactively for these transactions that occurred is to impose additional increases in capital gains taxes. And I think that would be a big mistake, because you're basically telling these businesses who are struggling, you know, that you're going to even be inflicted with more pain. Not unlike the shocking idea that you're going to claw back on repatriation dollars 2016 to 18, basically telling all these companies, bring your dollars home, and now that you brought them home, now we're going to tax you after you've got them home. I think that's unconscionable. So, you know, with that, I guess I'm just concerned about what we're going to do, whether you think that the only way that we're going to grow this economy back to its former resilience is through government spending, or whether we leave the dollars in the private sector to grow the economy and create the jobs that we're looking for. We know that two big pots of our revenue is from income taxes and consumption taxes, sales taxes. Those are the big things. So we got to put people back to work. If people are back to work, they're going to be spending their paychecks and money on the necessary things. And by growing government, another, well, from 48 billion up to 52 billion, as this is kind of proposing, I think is unconscionable when everybody else has had to tighten the belt. This is craziness, and it creates a moment in which going forward, we're going to only be having to deal with the new base. And unfortunately, there's too many people that think that anything less than an increase, an inflationary increase, is a cut. And in real dollars, it's not a cut. But we need to be as willing in government to face the hard realities that the private sector has. So on the capital gains, there was really no differentiation in the presentation. Are you talking only long-term capital gains or short-term as well?
Commissioner Schowalter, please. Walters.
Madam Chair, Representative, I was tracking up until that last question. Britta, I see your camera's on. Are you able to handle that?
I believe so. I believe it's long-term capital gains, Representative Hertaus, but let me just verify that quickly with Department of Revenue, but that's my understanding.
All right, Madam Chair.
And Madam Chair?
Yes, continue, please.
Madam Chair, Representative, appreciate the comments. I just want to point out that, as you said, for businesses that are struggling to keep going, that they're liquidating assets, trying to take, action in order to keep things going. That is essentially what the state is doing by using the reserve. Now, I was there, in fact, proposed with Governor Dayton to increase the reserves because I was there also when we had no reserves and we had like driving a car with no shock absorbers. It is not a good ride. It means that people have to take drastic actions, probably overreact at times when there's no other choice. So by creating those reserves, we created some buffer and ability to learn, ability to take some time, ability to sort of cushion Minnesotans from immediate action as we adjust and we phase into something long-term. I think that's an important concept. I think it's an important thing to have for the state, and a large reserve has been a great asset for everyone. It helped us this year not overreact to the May update, but to find out where we were at so that we know actually that we're in better shape financially than we thought, and we can take measured and targeted action that'll be more effective. That said, using it at this point in time also makes sense because just like those businesses and individuals you're talking about, this is a time where we have to make some tough decisions. And that is one of the things that the governor is recommending, knowing full well that is, a challenge, but it's one of those balancing things that we're having to look at. So just appreciated that point of view and I just wanted to comment on that. Thank you.
So we have about 20 minutes left. We have several.
Madam Chair.
We have
Madam
several
Chair.
questions. Representative Hertas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, on the short-term capital gains, that usually is taxed as ordinary income. And if there are short-term gains that people have done, regardless of whether it's real estate or other types of assets that are short-term gains, in order to keep their businesses afloat, that could very well push them into the fifth tier of income tax. So not only would they be facing a higher capital gains rate, but potentially if it's classified as short-term gains and not taxed at capital gains rates, which are preferred. However, when it's a pass-through income, the individual income tax rate may be beneficial than the capital gains rate. And again, I'll just circle back. I appreciate, Commissioner, your comments about the budget reserve, but frankly, I was all prepared that we were going to have to spend the budget reserve based on the projections that we're going to be sitting here at $2.6 billion deficit for this biennium. But in fact, we're showing a surplus because that federal money that's come in and a pretty strong consumption economy, despite the fact that we had massive layoffs. People have been spending their unemployment checks. So I disagree that it's appropriate to be spending this budget reserve down because it is going to cripple us in terms of being able to support growing the economy in the future if all of our excess revenues are going to have to be redeposited in the budget reserve. Again, my point is the government should be able to tighten its belt just as badly as the private sector has. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, we have about 20 minutes left. So what I would like to do moving forward, we have 4 presenters. So I'm going to ask our next representative to ask a question and the commissioner will respond to it. And we're going to go through the 4. And if we have time, we'll come back for your second question if you have one. And someone need to mute. Thank you. So Representative Petersburg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this question is really about unintended consequences for the commissioner. Thank you for your presentation. I have had to deal with budgets that have deficits and we've had to use reserves funds to accomplish them. And my concern is what happens in the next biennium and the next biennium after that. Obviously, we understand that when we use one-time revenue, such as reserve, to supplement our revenues this year, that we're going to have to make that up next year before we can have any additional growth in revenue. And so that kind of puts us into a big tailspin to some degree. And unless currently, I think this budget proposal will put the top tier up third highest. And unless we want to keep growing that, doesn't that mean that the additional revenue that we're going to need to collect is going to have to come from the lower tiers and the lower income?
making it much more regressive in dealing with that income into the future? And how have you kind of considered that effect? Because the only way I see it, unless we're going to reduce government, which hasn't happened in my history here, the expenses still have to be taken care of. Revenue still needs to be collected. And that means that we're going to have to generate additional revenue by lower income, which ultimately means that this one-time spending of reserve is actually regressive. Or am I missing something here, Commissioner?
Commissioner Schowalter, please.
Madam Chair, Representative, great question. And that's kind of the challenge that the Ways and Means Committee has, as well as the Budget Director and I have, of taking a long-term perspective of state finances and managing the budget reserve and sort of that balance of annual ins and outs, what we call the structural balance. And Budget Director Reitan closed up the presentation with a 5-year projection of what we see happening with this budget. I think the key consideration, having done budgets for many years prior to coming back now, is that we can kind of fall enamored with one set of projections and not understand that they're almost always going to change. And so I would probably stop and say that I don't necessarily assume that you have to have tax increases or regressive tax increases to support this. What I do know is right now we're trying to manage risk, manage uncertainty with the expectation that the economy will get underway, that we'll have an opportunity for growth and revenue over time. Because the only thing I know for sure is that the economy will keep on bouncing up and bouncing down. That whatever we think it is right now, it's undoubtedly going to change in the February forecast. It'll probably look again different next November as we keep on learning more about key questions like what happens with the federal government and what kind of assistance they're going to give us. What is going to be the path of the pandemic? We're starting to see case counts go down. Is that just a mirage and they're about to come zooming back with a more easily transmissible variant? Or are we in fact starting to make progress with our vaccination efforts? How do businesses and the business climate react and adjust to all the changes that are going on? There's a lot of big unknowns and we're working our way through it, but the reserve policy and the long range balance is all about managing those risks. And I think, I can say from MMB and the governor's perspective, we tried to manage those knowing that we have a long range perspective and an imperative right now to act so that we get out of the COVID period, that we recover as fast as possible, that we help kids, families, small businesses that need help right now. And if we wait for 3 or 4 years, we will probably not have as good of an economy as either of us would expect or want. So I agree, it's a balance.
Yeah. Representative Marquardt.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And, there's been some talk about tax conformity, and tomorrow in Taxes Committee, we're going to talk about basically the 4 federal bills that we will have to look at to whether or not we will conform and what provisions and so forth. But one thing mentioned today was the Paycheck Protection Program. And the state will not tax the loans, the PPP loans. What the state has to decide is whether or not to conform to whether or not we would deduct those expenses that the loans paid for. And we have a revenue estimate on that of just this biennium of $438 million, which means if the state was to conform to that deductibility, it would be a $438 million tax cut. And so unlike the federal government, the state government has to balance the budget. And so we're going to have to take a strategic targeted approach when we look at all items in the tax area, especially conformity. And we know that economically, this COVID-19 has not hit businesses the same. The latest December deed jobs report showed that hospitality and leisure sector, the bars, the restaurants, the fitness centers, the entertainment venues, they lost since before the pandemic 116,000 jobs. That's 44%. That's huge. So as a tax committee, we're going to have to look, because we don't have, and when we look at the full conformity, you'll see those numbers. It's even way more than that, of course. We have to really direct that to those businesses and areas that have been hit the hardest. And one other point I'd like to make is that, we've seen a couple federal stimulus packages dealing with COVID-19. And for the most part, I have heard nothing but good praises about those federal stimulus packages. Governor Walz has provided a COVID-19 recovery bill here. It's going to help our students get back on track. It's going to help our businesses and grow the economy. It's going to help our working families. And I would suggest that Governor Walz's strategy is much better than the federal government strategy, because Governor Walz pays for it. The federal government has raised the deficit just this year about $3.6 trillion. We're now our debt's $27.7 trillion on the federal level. Governor Walz balances the budget here as best he can, and he pays for it. So we can debate revenues and all those things, but the strategy is the right way to go. My question, Commissioner Schowalter, I have one, is what do you expect from the February forecast? There you go.
Commissioner Schowalter.
How much better?
Madam Chair, Representative, the representative knows full well that I'm not going to speculate on the record what the February forecast is going to be. But I think there's a couple of key things that are good news. One is that in November, we didn't have that second stimulus on the books. Our national forecasters actually dropped it from that November National Economic Outlook because it was too uncertain that Congress it didn't look like a deal could get done. That is now on the books. So that's going to help in the short term for sure with our economic performance and outlook for families and businesses. That's going to be better and more optimistic than it was before. I don't know if a third stimulus is going to be in the baseline. Right now it isn't, and I wouldn't expect it to be honest, but we'll see. That said, a lot happens between the GDP and the tax revenues. There's just all kinds of questions that we'll be investigating and working through in the February forecast. Same thing on spending. Were a lot of surprises. Typically, the February forecast is relatively on track with the November forecast because there's only a few things like holiday sales that gets adjusted. But, I think there's some good factors that are out there, and we'll see how they all work out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Yes. And Representative Mark, I just want to say thank you for responding to that question around the PPP. And also just reminding us that the work of the House is going to continue in different committees. And so thanks for that reminder also. So Representative Albright.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Schowalter, good morning. Governor Walz is calling for DHS to solely administer drug and dental benefits for people on public health programs again. Currently, those programs are often administered by managed care partners and private insurers with whom the state has contracts. So instead, the state's going to be essentially setting up their own PBM to administer those drug benefits. So you're going to save maybe $18 million in 23, but it looks like you're going to cost about $44 million in the 24-25. So my question to you is, how do you explain such an unfriendly business proposal, particularly when our own University of Minnesota trains so many of our dentists? Isn't that tantamount to a government takeover of pharmacy and dental benefits?
Commissioner Schowalter.
Madam Chair, Representative, great question, and definitely a topic worthy of continued discussion in the Human Services Committee. As you know, our performance in public programs on dental benefits is less than I think anybody would expect or want. And I think that has been a topic for the committee for a number of years of trying to how to raise that, because dental benefits obviously are part of an individual's overall health. And this is a proposal that on the dental side, DHS has pursued in the past and is, I think, bringing forward again as a way to try to raise the bar, not about government takeover. It's about how using all those trained professionals from the university to make sure that everyone, regardless of how you get your health care, you get those dental benefits. That's not always the case throughout the state. In terms of prescription drugs, again, a very thorny issue and worthy of additional discussion. Again, the question is, what is the locus? Because some of the drugs that we provide through our Medicaid program, known as medical assistance in Minnesota, are really expensive. And how do we manage what's known as a formulary so that we can manage those costs as a system so that no matter where an individual goes or which HMO they sign up with, that they have benefits and the kinds of things that they need for their particular situation? Those are tough questions. Those are the kinds of things that DHS is trying to work through. Appreciate you bringing them both up, but the bottom line is, in these places where I know people have been saying, we need to look at the budget, we need to find ways of reducing the spend. That is exactly what we're trying to do. We may disagree or agree on some of them, but these are some of the tough choices that we're going to have to go through in order to find ways to raise services and ultimately save the taxpayer money.
Commissioner Schowalter, thank you for responding to that question. Because and I just want to say we have some very experienced and dedicated chairs in Health and Human Services who care passionately about healthcare, dental care, and so I do expect that there would be more conversation that will happen within those committees. Representative Nash, then our last will be Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Wish I could do video, but I've got 3 distance learners crushing the internet here today.
Yes, understandable.
To the commissioners, and I don't remember if it was Assistant Commissioner Reitan or whom, but you mentioned a paid family medical leave option. I believe we've dealt with that for the last number of biennia as bills. I think former Representative Halverson had it last, but is this the same approach where you're going to hope to use the UI software, have to have Minute edit it and work on it heavily? And I believe the fiscal note to employers, employees, and to the state to build it out was, I believe, north of $60 million. Is that the same program?
Commissioner Schowalter?
Do you want me to jump in, Commissioner?
Sure. Madam Chair, State Budget.
Representative Nash, it is to some degree the same program. I don't think the build out costs are anticipated at that level. There is a detailed fiscal page in the budget materials that show some upfront costs paid for by the general fund that are then reimbursed from the account where we receive the premiums for paid family medical leave. But those upfront costs are in the ballpark in the first year of $11 million.
Madam Chair.
Representative Nash, I'm gonna give you
and then I'll be,
a minute.
This will be it. So, Madam Chair, and to either commissioner, we talked extensively about this and how it needs almost a year's runway to collect the taxes that will be then given back to the quote unquote recipients. Again, very regressive. It hits all employees and employers. So I'm just wondering, what's the rationale on that? And are my assumptions incorrect in that it's going to take a year in order to impart benefits?
Would that be Assistant Commissioner? Are you able to respond? Is that Commissioner Show?
Looks like she's looking at paper at the moment.
I am.
So I'll start.
If you give me 1 minute, I can respond. Yes.
I'll start with a general answer, and the budget director can follow in. Number one, just note that these are our premiums. So the idea that this is a sort of self-sustaining program with premiums with a benefit that go with it. So I understand the tax idea, but this is a benefit kind of proposition. I think the second thing that we're trying to do is make sure that it stands up and has a little bit of a runway. So you're absolutely right that the numbers don't start immediately, because the bottom line is that have a significant fiscal impact because the cash flow doesn't self-support it. Just like our state employee group insurance program, the health benefits that you have, they come in, they go out, but it takes a while to get it up and sustain it. So that's kind of the assumptions behind the budget. Britta.
All right.
Thank you, Commissioner. And we also have Liz Connor on. She's an executive budget officer that's been working in the details of this proposal. So Liz, do you want to just jump in for a quick minute about the lag between the premium collection and the benefit?
Sure. Madam Chair, Madam Chair, Representative, that is correct. There is a lag. The premiums start to be paid in fiscal year 23 and benefits start to be paid out in fiscal year 24.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That was exactly what I was looking for.
Thank you. Representative Legally.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to respond real quickly to the question that Representative Albright asked about carving out dental benefits and carving out pharmacy benefits. In fact, we're having a hearing today on the pharmacy benefit carve out, so stay tuned for that. I just wanted to point out that there's a huge irony, I would say, in talking about a government takeover of government programs. These are government programs. It's taxpayer money being used to buy benefits for public program patients. So I don't know where we get to, oh, this is government takeover of healthcare. This is an attempt to use dollars efficiently for government dollars, taxpayer dollars, to buy healthcare for people who are on government programs. So, and to figure out ways that we can help all of our citizens, honestly, but the main thrust of what we're trying to do is make sure that our government programs use our dollars efficiently. So I'm sure there will be plenty of debate. We're not going to decide that here today in Ways and Means, but I just wanted to push back on that a little bit because it just seems absurd to me to talk about government taking over government programs. Of course, in my view, we shouldn't be privatizing government programs because I think we can run them better, but that's not even what we're doing. We're just talking about specific pieces of them. And in fact, other states have done some of these things much better than we are, and there's a ton of money to be saved. So we'll discuss this in the appropriate committees, and thank you for your indulgence, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Lieberling. And so, you know, we don't have any other questions, I believe. And so I just want to end by saying I want to thank the commissioner and the assistant commissioner and staff for presenting this information at a very high level, knowing that more conversation, more engagement will come at the committee level. Questions today put forth were, I believe, very good questions, and, you know, with some excellent responses. You know, we are in unprecedented time, in a moment in time. You know, COVID-19 has showed up and just taken us all off our regular processes. That is not where we are. And I think we really deserve to do the best that we can as a state for our students, for our institutions, for businesses, you know, and, you know, I'm really thankful that we have this reserve that was created back in 2013 and 14 to tap into it, because that is one of the reasons it is there for moments like this in these unprecedented times. And so, again, thank you all for being here. And since there's no other business of the committee, we are adjourned.